Good. My name is Hannah White, and I'm on the Board of Directors for the Asian Pacific American Student Affairs. We, as the Board of Directors, help increase awareness of the experiences and issues facing the diverse ethnic communities represented within APASA. We also provide academic, educational, and cultural resources to help students engage themselves in an ever-increasingly global society. This afternoon, we are proud to partner with the UofA College of Education to help bring Professor Mitchell Chang here with us. We are in for an inspiring lecture about affirmative action, a topic that impacts us all as college students. This event is one of many that APASA organizes throughout the year. In addition, we hold discussions on difficult topics like privilege and gender identity and bring in performers to showcase multiple identities. We invite you to join us next week on November 18th from 2 to 3 p.m. for an info session and kickoff of another exciting part of our work in APASA. It's called our Internship Preparation Program, also known as IPP. Through IPP, we partner with Career Services to guide participants through the process of applying and preparing for internships. This includes working with the UA Edge program, resume workshops, mock interviews, and an etiquette dinner. Before we hear from today's guest speaker, I'd like to introduce Professor Jeff Milam. He is an Ernest W. McFarland Distinguished Professor in the College of Education here at the University of Arizona. Professor Milam is also the Director of the Arizona Medical Education Research Initiative and will give us a warm welcome from the College of Education. Please welcome Professor Jeff Milam.
Good afternoon. Come on. Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Jeff Milam, and I'm honored to be the Ernest W. McFarland Distinguished Professor in Leadership for Education Policy and Reform. Get that on a business card. I'm from the College of Education, where I teach in the Center for the Study of Higher Education here at the UofA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth in the Ernest W. McFarland Lecture Series. Anybody know who Ernest McFarland was? Funny, I should just happen to prepare a little bit of information about him. He's actually a very interesting and important person from Arizona history. And in large part could be responsible for me standing before you today as someone with college education. McFarland was an American politician, and with Warren Atherton was one of the fathers of the GI Bill. My father attended college because of the GI Bill, and I attended college because my father attended college. He was a Democratic senator from Arizona from 1941 to 1953, during which time he served as the Senate Majority Leader in the U.S. Senate between 51 and 53. He then was defeated for re-election by Barry Goldwater, another famous Arizona senator. But he didn't stop there. He came back to Arizona, where he ran for and was elected as governor of Arizona. He served as governor from 1955 to 1959. Finally, he still wasn't tired. I would have been happy with those achievements. But he sat as the Chief Justice on the Arizona Supreme Court from 1968 to 1970. As such, he's the only Arizonan to serve in the highest office in all three branches of Arizona government, two at the state level and one at the federal level. As you can see, a pretty remarkable citizen and leader in our state. As a way to honor Senator, Governor, Justice McFarland, not long after I learned that I'd been named the McFarland Professor, I decided to create the McFarland Lecture Series, in which I decided I'd bring important educators, policymakers, and scholars to the University of Arizona to talk about key issues and concerns related to the educational and social policy issues important to our local community, our state community, our national and international community. I was very pleased to be able to convince my friend and colleague, Dr. Mitchell Chang, to join us today. Mitch, as I said, is the fourth McFarland lecturer, and I'm also very pleased that the Asian Pacific American Student Affairs Office, APASA, is serving as co-sponsor for this event. I've known Mitch for more than 20 years, which is weird because, he's only 31. I've known Mitch for more than 20 years, and I have tremendous admiration and respect for the work that he's done as a scholar and as a public intellectual during that time. My collaborations with Mitch have been some of the most stimulating and satisfying work that I've done in my career. I'm going to stop offering accolades to Mitch at this time as one of our UofA students have the honor of introducing him to you this afternoon. But after Chris's introduction of Mitch, I hope that you'll join me in giving a warm Tucson welcome to my colleague, my friend, my brother from another mother, Mitchell Chang.
Thank you, Dr. Madeline. As he said, my name is Chris Rosales, and I am currently a first-year master's student in the higher education program here at the University of Arizona. And I'm also a graduate assistant working with fraternity and sorority programs, coordinating academic and leadership initiatives for the Greek community. When I started my undergraduate career 4 years ago, I went in with the mindset that I was going to pursue the STEM fields. However, that mindset slowly began to change as I became involved with APASA's BOD, became a peer advisor for students on academic probation, and advised incoming first-year students as they transitioned into life at the University of Arizona. As I became involved with all of this, I knew that a career in higher education was something that I wanted to pursue. My ultimate goal is to make an impact on higher education, as today's guest of honor has for Asian American students. Mitchell J. Chang is a professor of higher education and organizational change and Asian American students studies at UCLA. Professor Chang's research focuses on diversity-related issues and initiatives on college campuses. He has written over 90 publications, some of which were cited in the U.S. Supreme Court ruling of Grutter v. Bollinger, a case involving the use of race-conscious admissions practices. He received a National Academy of Education and Spencer Fellowship in 2001 and was recognized for outstanding research in both 2000 and 2008 by the American College Personnel Association. In 2006, Diverse Issues in Higher Education profiled him as one of the nation's top 10 scholars. Professor Chang has also been elected to serve as a board member for the American Educational Research Association and the Association for the Study of Higher Education, for which he received the Founders Service Award in 2014. Today, Professor Chang's talk is entitled Asian Americans and Affirmative Action, Contending with Dominant Racial Narratives. Even though Asian Americans are enrolling in higher education at a pace that exceeds the rate of all other race groups, we have not had a strong collective presence regarding one of the most contentious educational issues, namely the application of race-conscious admissions. This changed with Fisher v. University of Texas at Austin, whereby various Asian American organizations submitted separate friend of the court briefs to inform the U.S. Supreme Court's decision. One set of briefs opposed the university's application of race-conscious measures, whereas another set supported it. Professor Chang will disentangle these contrasting positions and consider the extent to which that debate served to either reinforce or disrupt enduring racial narratives about Asian Americans. He will conclude by discussing the significance of such contending forms of civil rights activism on racial politics. Please welcome Professor Mitchell Chang.
For that very kind introduction. You almost started to give my talk, so I'm glad I got up here when I did. And also I want to thank Jeff for inviting me to be here and enjoy your lovely weather, and also APASA for co-sponsoring this. I hope I will leave you with some impression, good or bad. I also had the pleasure earlier when I arrived to have lunch with my colleagues at the higher education program here, a world-class program. I like to think of UCLA as the Arizona of the West, and we have a lot of cross-pollination between these two programs, and I'm thankful for that. One of the one thing we both share is a connection to a very important scholar who recently passed away, and her name is Aston. Get a little, little emotional here because her husband is my mentor. Okay. If you can join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. She passed away 2 weeks ago, so it's still really fresh for us, and we know that her spirit and her remarkable intellectual contributions to our field and to the human race really is still with us. So we both programs share that, and I just wanted to make sure we acknowledge that. Okay, now to the work at hand. So today what I want to talk about is actually an old story, but I want to tell it with some new twists. And this is a very complicated story. And it may not be for you, but the last couple of weeks when I was trying to wrap my head around it, it got more and more complicated. So this is also a relatively new work for me. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to stand behind this podium, and which I don't usually like to do, and rely on my notes a little more than usual. But the good thing is, I think some of you will probably recognize parts of the story, and some of you may have even read last week in the New York Times an article titled, "Why Are Asian Americans Such Loyal Democrats?" Any of you catch that? Okay, I guess the New York Times isn't popular here, but you know, you can read it online. Anyway, okay, so it's worth reading, but in any case, I'm sure you'll recognize parts of this story, and that'll be very helpful to me because I also have a time limit here, and I'll try my best to stay within the time frame. And because these parts are very complicated. I'm not going to have time to go into the details of each one, which would be worthy of its own close examination. And but in the interest of time here, I try my best to kind of condense this very complicated story into 3 parts. The first part, race-conscious emissions, or broadly for those here known as the topic of affirmative action. Asian Americans in higher education is that second part of the story, and racial narratives, the third. And then the 4th part of what I'll be talking about today is trying to bring these 3 together and look at the convergence of these 3 parts. And before I get going any further, also want to note that I'm using this term Asian Americans. I know that this term has its limitations and is problematic in some ways, but I'm situating my discussion today within the current U.S. racial context. So I'm going to use this term and will hint at some of its limitations later in my talk. So let's get to it, and so feel free to, at this point, just relax and try to enjoy it, and I'll do my best to keep you entertained. Let's start with probably the most complicated or difficult part of this, and that is race-conscious emissions. And as many of you know, this is a practice that emerged from an affirmative action model of civil rights. And affirmative action, for those who haven't studied it, certainly covers much more than college admissions. And in fact, it initially targeted employment and government contracting. And as affirmative action rolled around, I don't think very many people realized that it wasn't a logical extension of the 1960s civil rights model. In fact, according to David Scribney in his book, The Ironies of Affirmative Action, I'm going to quote him here, affirmative action happened incrementally, unintentionally, in behind-the-scenes meeting of White House officials and meetings of administrators, and in pragmatic nickel-and-dime court decisions. In short, according to Scribney, the difficulty in prosecuting racial discrimination led to a more pragmatic model to manage the nation's racial crisis, which actually got worse after the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, one of the many ironies that he pointed to. Now, the pragmatic model of affirmative action departed from the civil rights one in several key ways, and I want to point those out. Number one, with the 1964 civil rights model, in sum, it focused more on eliminating intentional discrimination through enforcement of non-discrimination. Now try to figure out how that works in practice, especially in the courts. Number two, it had a colorblind philosophy. It was more inspired by a colorblind philosophy, repudiating the use of race as a basis for making key judgments. The civil rights model also supported the idea of abstract individualism and the idea of democracy, and the goals targeted were around integration. Now, the affirmative action model departs from that model in several important ways. Instead of this abstract idea of eliminating discrimination through non-discrimination, the affirmative action model created timetables and numerical goals to show that we are making significant gains and addressing and correcting the imbalance. Now, it took on a more race-conscious approach, and I think Justice Harry Blackmun's opinion here in Bakke captures as well. He wrote, in order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way. The affirmative action model also supported the idea that opportunities and life chances are shaped by ascribed group classification, such as race. And the goals here were more targeting self-determination. So you can see that this is the affirmative action model is somewhat of a departure from the 1960s civil rights model. And I wanted to point this out because this explains why modern day civil rights activities are somewhat tricky, and that opponents of affirmative action can legitimately claim to be champions of civil rights legislation, and have done a remarkable job at these appropriating some of that 1960s civil rights rhetoric. Now, as I mentioned earlier, affirmative action touches more than just one sector of U.S. life, but touches upon multiple domains. But higher education has been a central battle, at least legally, for affirmative action. And we have seen a number of cases pass through
challenging race-conscious admissions through the U.S. Supreme Court. Here, you know, I list these key cases, but I'm not going to. While I would love to talk about the details of each, which are fascinating, I'm not going to get into it. But with each court decision, what's important to recognize is that the court has pulled back these practices with each decision. I mean, with Baki, for example, the court ruled as being unconstitutional the use of quotas. So certainly anybody practicing race-conscious, you know, a policy in any way using quotas, that would be unlawful. And then with the Grass decision, one of the two Michigan cases, the courts ruled that colleges cannot treat race in a mechanical or mechanistic way, further pulling back or constraining those efforts. But in the end, at least so far, even up to Fisher, the courts have not banned the use of race when colleges consider admissions. So that's all I want to point out here, even though I would love to do more, because the court, the U.S. Supreme Court, is scheduled to hear Fisher again in their current session. So you're going to see a lot more in the news in the next few months as the court continues their current session. But I do want to point out, for those that aren't familiar with U.S. Supreme Court decisions, that they're pretty significant. And these decisions, according to my colleague at UCLA, Gary Orfield, who gave the ARA Brown lecture last year, he knows that these decisions have deep and lasting impacts. And it is, but not only legally, but morally, because the public, according to him, look up to the court to be kind of our moral voice. So their decisions here are quite important and closely watched. And then you add to this that these affirmative action cases receive more legal and public interest than almost any other case heard by the Supreme Court besides Roe v. Wade. So these are quite remarkable cases and closely watched. I just want to make sure we understand the significance of these cases. So what does this have to do with Asian Americans? Well, according to Frank Wu, at least up to the point when he wrote his groundbreaking book in 2002, almost nothing. Almost nothing. And he thought that was highly problematic. And I have this quote here. He said that leaving out Asian Americans from consideration, I pulled this here to read it, of affirmative action, and it relegates us to the role of bystanders and suggests that we are neither Americans nor minorities. And he further adds that, and further encourage Asian Americans to participate more actively in not only these debates, but in civil rights debates, and in order to amplify our presence in U.S. society. And according to him, so that at the very least, we are not inserted cynically into the affirmative action debate. And indeed, Asian Americans do have a lot at stake when it comes to civil rights. And I'm not going to go through the history of racism here against Asian Americans because you have Asian American studies. Whoops, I'm sorry, you don't. still wondering why. But if you did, you would know these highlights very well, and I'm sure and hopeful that in the near future you will. I know people in this room are working on it. And anyway, the racism against Asian Americans in U.S. history is very, very well documented, and this is just a very, this just only scratches the surface, as you know. In 1882 there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and by 1924 that almost eliminated all legal rights for not just the Chinese in the U.S. By the way, they weren't Chinese Americans because they can be citizens, but the Chinese in the U.S. But all Asians except for Filipinos, because there was an interesting colonial arrangement there. But even for Filipinos, but in 1930, is it 35? Did I get that right? 35, the Tidings-McDuffie Act limited even their migration to the U.S. And then there is the executive order that imprisoned Japanese Americans. In this case, I use Americans here because a good portion of them, 2/3, were actual U.S. citizens, and I think that qualifies as an act of racism because not one was ever convicted as being a spy, and in fact, many also fought on behalf of the U.S. in the Europe front. And then we get to 1980s, and there's Vincent Chin, who was brutally murdered, and those who murdered him was sentenced to 2 years of probation and $3,700 fine, and did not receive a jail sentence. This was one of my generation, one of the very eye-opening moments. And then today, I mean, perhaps less brutal. I don't know why I picked these three, but what's her name? Cyrus. Did anyone see this or her catch this? I'm not on Facebook. We talked about why I avoided that, but she was caught doing the slant eye thing, and I'm not sure what this guy was thinking at this time. It's an Asian American who's and this is a Fox reporter. He was asked a comment here about China. He used the term Chinaman, and then here we have Alexandra Wallace, and this hit home because a few years ago I'm at UCLA, and she posted something on YouTube expressing her opinions about Asians in the library, which got a lot of notice, and her departure from UCLA. But what was interesting about this, by the way, is that she was a third-year political science major. And I hold UCLA accountable for this in many ways, because how can you be at UCLA 3 years and not recognize that this is going to have negative consequences? Anyway, that's perhaps another lecture. Like I said, I'll try not to get too complicated here, but this is just a cherry picking some evidence that this is not a history that we yet escape. And perhaps because of this, Asian Americans have been strong supporters of the civil rights agenda, the modern liberal one especially, and are still largely supportive of affirmative action, as seen by these two different polls, one asking about support of race-conscious emissions. You see that depending on your political identification or orientation, you're going to have majority support, and depending on your ethnic grouping here, you identify as Asian Americans, your 76% also said that they supported affirmative action. What's curious here, too, I think, is that you're finding, I should put in bold here, but you're finding that 38% of Asian Americans that identify as Republicans also supported race-conscious affirmative action, or at least for college admissions. So I find this to be really interesting, but I also was surprised, and maybe because of my own political leanings and biases, that the numbers aren't higher. The numbers aren't higher, and because of the fact that Asian Americans have a self-interest here in eradicating racism. But the relationship between Asian Americans and affirmative action is a very tricky and delicate. I'm going to tell you about the story. And I think it's especially complicated because of a pair of enduring racial narratives that are continuously told about Asian Americans. So this gets to the third part of my story. So hang in there, we're almost through here. The third part, and that's racial narratives. So what are racial narratives? In his groundbreaking book, Orientalism, Edward Said referred to such popular stories as invented imaginations. So while these racial stories or projections may be largely fiction, the constant retelling of them over a long period of time, let's say through the media, through media images, through stories, through schooling, et cetera, the constant retelling of these stories over a long period of time make them part of what Durkheim calls the collective conscious. And the collective conscious, according to him, is very powerful because it has a way of steering our behaviors and thinking in a collective, both conscious and unconscious way. And in this case, has the power to reinforce the racial divide and dominance. And with dominance, in this case, to further affirm white identity, expertise, and mastery. For Asian Americans, this pair of racial narratives has been especially enduring and pernicious, limiting social possibility and constraining how Asian Americans are widely viewed and treated, especially within the context of U.S. higher education. And you're going to see very clearly what I'm talking about here. One of these narratives is, of course, the model minority myth. And hopefully, even without Asian American studies here, I'm hoping most of you have at least been exposed to this. But in case you haven't, this is a narrative that characterizes Asian Americans as hardworking, problem-free overachievers, and emphasizes their high achievement, or what I point to as general quality. And the problem with it, of course, is that it ignores the diversity of circumstances in this very diverse population, not only economically and culturally, but also certainly educationally, as pointed out by this graph. As you can see, the educational attainment varies quite a bit between different ethnic groups within the Asian race category. But this method ignores that as seen in exemplified in this picture. I'm not going to say anymore because you could read a lot about the critiques of this. There are many good critiques, and they're very easy to access. The other myth I want to touch upon, you probably haven't heard as much about is this idea of Asians as the yellow peril. Now, this was one of those invented imaginations in around the 1880s, late 1880s, when there was heavy negative sentiments about the Chinese. And the basic premise is that the further growth, the fear, try to incite fear of the further growth of Asian American population, and specifically Chinese, and to characterize this growth as a threat to U.S. society, because these heathens or perpetual foreigners would undermine the social structure and patterns of American society. And this is part of this yellow peril narrative. And this narrative, unlike the model minority one, highlights quantity over quality, which is a difference in the focus between the two. But both are regularly retold when discussing Asians and Asian Americans in the higher education context, especially when it comes to talking about university and college admissions. And this script emphasizes what has been called the yellowing of the nation's most selective and prestigious colleges. An example of this is, this here by Bill Clinton when he quoted defending affirmative action. He said, "There are universities in California that could fill their entire freshman classes with nothing but Asians." Now, I mean, as you know, I am a supporter of race-conscious policies, but that took me, I took a couple steps back reading that. But this is an example, right, of this yellow peril narrative. Anyway, you put the two together, and you have a really potent set of strategies here. And here's an example of how these two narratives converge in the debate over affirmative action. Now, this comes from a amicus brief that was filed about 2 weeks ago by a conservative think tank, the California Association of Scholars. And I can write a better statement that converges these two narratives. They wrote, "Today, the problem for liberals," and they're criticizing and they're opponents of affirmative action. "Today, the problem for liberals is not just too many whites, but too many Asians." Okay, so here, telling this in terms of yellow peril. Asians, this is the next sentence, by the way. "Asians are perceived as a new upstart student," minority. So you see how these narratives converge now in positioning Asian Americans within this affirmative action debate. And the opponents have done a very good job redefining these narratives. And they also point to Tom Espenshad's research, and you see this quoted. I mean, it's like the only, the one thing that they always point to. Asians need to have a score of 1,600. I mean, an additional 140 points on the SATs, or in this case, they point to the fact that those of us 1,600 have the same chances of being accepted as somebody with 40. So it's always this idea of that meritocracy is quantified at least legitimately through using SAT scores. But what's interesting here for me is that these aren't new stories. Like I said, these are old stories with a new twist. In the 1980s, we went through with the civil rights, the Education Office of Civil Rights complaints about the capping of Asian admissions by highly selective universities. The UCs became investigated. They were investigated by the Office of Civil Rights because of these complaints. Now, that was a very different complaint than how it's being, how those opponents are using it today. In the 80s, civil rights organization fighting for the interests of Asian Americans complained that quotas were being used to cap enrollment. And as you know, through the Baki decision, the quotas were already deemed to be unconstitutional. This is not something, of course, that was brought up now. So, as evidence here of discrimination. But the interesting thing here, I think, about what happened in the 80s is that this wasn't really picked up by the liberal establishment. And conservatives, especially in California, saw it as an opportunity to recruit Asian Americans to grow their minority base. I mean, even they recognized at the time that the demographics were changing, and that there needs, much to the chagrin of some at that time, needs to build up a stronger minority base. And Dana Takagi, who wrote this book, The Retreat from Race. Hopefully this is in your library. It should be if it isn't. Wrote this account in 1992, and it still seems so relevant today. This was her dissertation, by the way. So those who are here writing dissertations, they may not be noticed right away, but hopefully 10 years from now, somebody will be they'll turn into a book, and somebody will be pointing to it as see, so-and-so did this 10 years ago, or in this case, more than that. And she chronicles these lessons that we didn't seem to have learned very well. So, and that made room for what came about in the last few years, and that is a stronger amplification of Asian American presence, especially when it came to affirmative action, as Wu had encouraged, but perhaps not exactly what he had intended. And one of these trends is that there has been a stronger voicing, what I call pent-up sentiments that were largely silent and overlooked, but had been, concerns since the 80s. And here's an example of that sentiment. I need to come around and read this. This was written as an op-ed piece by Michael Wang, who also filed the complaints against Harvard, and maybe Yale too was included on that complaint. But it also falls very much in line with another complaint filed against Princeton. But it's this idea that that applying to college is so dreadful for Asian American families, because they know that their race will be used against them in admissions. And there is nothing they can do but over-prepare. So a sentiment that's being voiced more frequently, and you see this on the internet as well. And then another trend is this organization called Students for Fair Admissions has found an opportunity to enlist Asian Americans for their lawsuits against universities. In fact, they actively recruited Students for Fair Admissions as a spin-off of another organization that was involved in finding Fisher for the University of Texas case, Abigail Fisher. But on their website, they actually try to recruit Asian Americans for this lawsuit. And since then, have filed one against the University of North Carolina and Harvard. And those, depending on what happens with Fisher, those may be the next cases that come up. And those cases will have, as plaintiffs, Asian American applicants. But I think we have time here. So I have to say something about Students for Fair Admissions, because to me it's a quite curious organization. Okay, the head of this is a guy by the name of Ed Bloom. Now, he was involved in Fisher versus, and continues to be involved with the Fisher versus University of Texas case. In fact, he drove the Fisher family to the court to hear the decision. But anyway, Ed Bloom lives in Maine. Okay, and as you know, the Student for Fair Admission, Ed Bloom in particular, now claims to be a champion for Asian American civil rights interests. Now, when I checked the demographics of Maine, there were not too many Asian Americans to stand in defense of. There were there are about 18,000 Asian, those identified as Asian Americans living in Maine, making up about 1.4% of the population now. Compare that against UCLA. There are 13,000 graduate and undergraduate students at UCLA that identify as Asian Americans, making up 35% of the undergraduate student population and 22% of the graduate population. And then you add in faculty, staff, and visitors. This means on any given day on the UCLA campus, you have almost as many Asians on campus as you do in the whole state of Maine. Now I'm thinking that if Ed really wants to help us, he should. I'm just being cynical here. You should come out to UCLA. But I'm pointing out the absence of Asian Americans in Maine because, according to a recent study by Frank Sampson, which was published in 2013 in Comparative Education Review, the proportion of Asian population relative to the white population matters in how whites respond to the interests of Asian Americans. He conducted an experimental study and found that when white students were asked to play the part of an admissions officer and presented with a freshman enrollment trend that showed that Asians were outnumbering whites, those students adjusted the admission standards so that more whites than Asians would be admitted. This was not the case when other enrollment trends were presented to these white students. So the conclusion here is so much more meritocracy when it doesn't benefit. So that's another trend that we should keep an eye on. Another trend is what happened in California this past year, SCA 5. Now, SCA 5 refers to a Senate Constitution amendment written by a congressman in the Valley in California to overturn the ban on considering race in admissions just for the University of California. So some of you may know that the UC stopped considering race in 1996 when the citizens of California passed Proposition 209. And that reached into more than university university admission. So SCA 5 is just focusing on the UCs. Now, in order for this, this proposal to get on the ballot, it had to pass through both the California Senate and the Assembly. And in January of this year, it passed through the Senate. And then the Chinese press, the ethnic Chinese press got a hold of the story. And it became their calling to kill it. I mean, I don't know how to put it in any other way. So they did a very good job of giving this a lot of airtime, and the Chinese, ethnic Chinese community put pressure on the politicians, specifically 7 of the Chinese senators and Congress people. And this pressure, one of the results of this pressure is that the senators who had initially supported this bill rescinded. And these senators were very, very important because in the vote, because they were considered a swing vote for ensuring that this would pass. So by the middle of the year, it had reached the Assembly and pretty much died there. So this is very interesting because it suggests that when it comes to race-conscious admissions, especially in higher education, it is a third rail of politics. And Asian American politicians are also afraid to touch it because they know that they could potentially suffer some negative consequences. So things have changed since, certainly since Dana wrote her book, but some things still remain the same. This is a picture of protests against SCA 5. So what I wanted to do was, unlike what Frank focused on, he encouraged Asian Americans to be more involved in these debates, not knowing that it would kind of take these weird turns. But since the last few years and all the developments, I was interested in how civil rights organizations were positioning Asian Americans in the affirmative action because I've done a lot of work looking at race-conscious admissions. So I was particularly interested in how were Asian Americans being positioned here, and how were they being characterized? How were their interests being characterized? And in doing this, do they reinforce or challenge racial narratives? Because if they don't, my feelings here was in the long run, what they were doing was it wasn't going to benefit Asian Americans in the long run, because these are narratives that continue to structure how we are considered and perceived in U.S. society. So I did a study here, and I looked at these briefs filed for the filed in the Fisher case in the last hearing in 2012, and I thought it was this set of briefs was particularly interesting and appropriate because not only, again, it was one of the record numbers of amicus briefs submitted, 90 total, but in the main brief of the petitioner, and this is Fisher's brief, that claim that these practices are discriminatory, that in this main brief by Fisher, it mentions Asian Americans 22 times in her brief. Let me back up a little, because not all of you have studied law here, so I appreciate the fact that you may not know what these briefs are. Now, these briefs, amicus briefs, can be filed by nearly anybody, but they have to be written in a particular style that usually requires legal training. And So they're submitted for a very narrow purpose, and that is to persuade the justices in taking on a certain position. So that they're very, very one-sided. And so in that respect, you know, they're not meant to be scholarly, well-balanced thoughts. But they're important in that they become a part of the Supreme Court record, and the public can have access to them. And we know through legal scholarship that these briefs and these decisions are studied by future generations. So in that sense, they are important. Anyway, I know I'm running out of time, so I want to get to see folks have to run off to their next obligations. I want to get into, or at least highlight my study. And I focused here, and this is a study, by the way, that I wrote up for a new book by Umaja Kumar and Liliana Garces, or two rising stars, if not already stars, in the study of higher education. The title of it is Affirmative Action and Racial Equity, Considering the Fisher Case to Forge the Path Ahead. And what I did for the chapter was to look at 4 briefs in particular. And these 4 briefs were submitted as the lead of these briefs, Asian American civil rights organizations. So 4 of these supported Fisher, and they were, you know, written by the Asian American Legal Foundation, and this is group 80/20. In other words, these briefs allege that race-conscious measures being practiced in admitting undergraduates at UT discriminated against Asian American applicants, and should be summarily abolished. And then another set of 2 briefs. So I mean, I just want to balance 2 and 2, but also it just happened that 2 sets of briefs opposed and 2 sets of briefs supported the University of Texas use of race in admitted students. And these were submitted by these 2 organizations. Now, as I said, I was specifically interested in how Asian Americans were characterized, especially in light of the dominant racial narratives of the model minority and the yellow peril one. And interested in how these have the potential as scripts to dismantle these narratives in the future. So unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go into the specifics of my findings. I just want to highlight some important points for the purposes of my talk. And what I found was, you know, quite mixed on both sides. And one side I found did a pretty good job. The briefs supporting Fisher and arguing for the elimination of race-conscious admission did a very good job addressing the yellow peril narrative, and especially focusing on this sense of anxiety felt by having an increase of Asian Americans and what universities were trying to do about it. And then, but it did actually reinforce the model minority myth, because it continued to emphasize how well qualified and so-called over-prepared Asian applicants were being denied admissions. On the other side, supporting the University of Texas, I found that they overlooked the yellow peril narrative. They overlooked evidence of anxiety on campus created by the so-called yellow wing of the university. And which you know, the other pointed out quite well. But they addressed well the model minority myth and emphasized the diversity of this population and its shared interests with other racial minorities. So what can we say here about this hard, systematic and arduous study. Well, unfortunately, not too much, but let me stretch a little here and map it back on to the three key parts of the story that I pointed to earlier. When it comes to civil rights, it's not so clear who's the champion or who's not. Both sides can make a really darn good argument that they're for justice. Unlike what Dana Takagi documented, neither retreated from race. In fact, race was a central and important theme, especially the history of racism against Asian Americans. Both sides documented that very well, interestingly enough. But the problem is that both scripts fail to offer a narrative structure that adequately challenges both the mono-minority and the old peril narratives. One did better on dressing one than the other, and vice versa. So another problem here is that these divergent stories and policy positions amplify the presence of Asian Americans in contradictory and problematic ways. And when you kind of take them together as a whole, what you get is a lot of confusion. A lot of confusion that I argue in this chapter that makes a lot of room. I'm not just going to say this is going to happen or that's going to happen, but it creates a great deal of room for the further estrangement of Asian Americans. Not only with other race minority groups, but also between each other in terms of interests. And this has serious implications when you talk about racial politics. So, thank you for bearing with me. I'm almost at the finish line here. So I'm glad you guys stuck around for this final punchline. So why should we care here? Well, debates over remedies to address past and present racism, that's not going to go away anytime soon, as we all well know. In fact, the debates will accelerate, in my judgment, with even higher stakes and beyond debates over affirmative action. There are currently about 17.2 million Asian Americans, and growing in the U.S., and it's considered, and more, an important political constituency. But my judgment here, my read of these briefs suggests that this population is at a crossroad. And it's not altogether clear how this is politically, which direction we're, as a population, collectively, will move. Now, so if I have to give some suggestions, this is, so bear with me, because I'm just riffing here. If I have to give, some heads up here, this is what I would point to regarding, especially regarding the political positioning. I worry about the Democratic Party because they haven't always taken issues, Asian American issues, very seriously. It hasn't been an important part of the liberal establishment agenda. And I don't think they can afford to sweep these issues, these unresolved issues from the 80s under the rug. Because we're seeing that they don't go away. They don't go away. They come back in different forms. So there has to be more attention given to these sentiments and to these problems. Conservatives know this really well, and they are doing a very good job, very good job courting Asian Americans. And if Hillary repeats what Bill did, that's going to be very problematic for the democratic support of Asian Americans, and I think they will be challenged in describing Asian Americans as being loyal. Okay. Now, when it comes to Asian Americans as the grassroots, you know, the grassroots civil rights organizations, I would say that there's some repairing that needs to be done here. And this is, and one place to start is to recognize the limitations of the scripts that are being used to position Asian Americans and how they are being understood or interpreted through dominant racial narratives. And as such, we're not going to get long-term results in significantly changing how Asian Americans are being perceived or treated unless these scripts do a better job addressing those dominant racial narratives. And then lastly, regarding race-conscious admissions. Now, after Fisher hopefully is done with, I think, you know, the higher ed community has to take a more serious look at how these debates have been confined within particular ideologies. That is, we haven't done a very good job calling out that these positions that taken on race-conscious admissions are largely being debated within a ideology that supports a stratified, highly stratified system of higher education. A system whereby being admitted by one of the elite universities is viewed as a prize, where the winner takes all. So this kind of system, I think, is seriously flawed if the interest here is really, you know, a greater democratization of these of our higher education system, and providing not just access, which is I mean, we have, you know, in this time in our history, this is the best access to higher education that we've ever had. But not only access, but access to education that's going to make a difference in disrupting the reproduction of you know, our social system and economic system. And so I really worried about how these issues continue to be discussed. And with that, I'll take questions. So thank you for your attention. Yes.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk, Dr. Chang. So my question is, it seems like, at least from my experience in my own graduate program, that Asian Americans, and I'm one, it's only me, are beleaguered by international student admission. So I've actually been told explicitly that among the faculty who do the admission, in the past in my program, it's easier to admit international students like from China or Indonesia or Thailand because they're funded by their government, so we don't have to give them jobs because their English isn't good enough to teach here. And the Asian Americans don't have good enough English to be admitted, so we might as well admit the ones with the money. And what that says is that we're all one group. So it says that we're not really Americans, or it says that those people who are foreigners are the same as us. And I see that with like the Latinos in my program as well. They're bringing in more people from abroad and reducing the number of people who are domestic, who are actual Latinos, to come in. And so
I see like if we're going to talk about grassroots, like I see how like the Americans kind of have to band together, like the Latinos, the Blacks, the Asian Americans, we have to like get together. But it's really hard to figure it out from the admissions end because we're looking at each other as we're competing against each other. But really it seems like some of the competition is coming from abroad. Because they're also, one of the things that's happening is that they're sending these new Asian Americans, they come here, they become Americans, they're sent back because they're not citizens. So we are still keeping our numbers low in university. They're getting the training, but we're not moving up in the university to become professors or researchers.
So thank you for raising that because this was complicated enough, and this has a whole different layer to it. And my good friend Rob Teranishi, a colleague at UCLA, who does a lot of work looking at the trends in enrollment, he found that of the PhDs that were awarded the last 10 years for Asian Americans, the majority of them were awarded to non-citizens, non-U.S. citizens in the U.S. But I'm going to say a couple of things. I want to pass it on to an expert on this, Jenny Lee. but I want to point to a couple of things that are interesting. You say that this is a competition between Asian Americans and Asian internationals or whatever. In part it is, but here's the other little dirty secret about admissions at the graduate level, particularly in the sciences. Now, we discovered this when we were doing work. I did a 8-year study looking at enrollment in the sciences, and we went to 8 different institutions and different types of institutions at that, and interviewed graduate students, faculty members, and so forth. Plus, we had an advisory group of science faculty and so forth. And one thing we didn't expect to pick up was this issue about international Asian students. Now, here's a dirty little secret that in fact, science faculty, no one will go on record to say this, but science faculty prefer, they were telling us directly and indirectly, prefer international students. Why? Well, they told us that my labs need 24/7 attention. 24/7 attention, including through the holidays. So who's going to stick around? Those teens. Oh, my domestic students, they want to go skiing. They want to take, breaks. And those international students, you can rely on. Obviously, this is exploitation. One group is easier. Graduate students are already very vulnerable, but you can even further exploit a particular group. And so this is one layer that we have to look into is this vulnerability of graduate students. And we know that international students are vulnerable. I'm going to hand it to Jenny to talk about that. But we also know that there is a culture of exploitation here that we have to address. And before we get into, hey, your group is doing this, my group is doing that, right? So there's another layer that we have to really pay attention to. Jenny, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll keep it really quick. We're really interested in hearing what you think. But I will say just broadly that trying to promote the interests of marginalized groups and trying to deal with issues of social justice and inequality are not the same thing. And I mean this by talking about marginalized groups here, as Mitch described. What makes the UofA great is largely their international students and faculty. What makes the U.S. a strong powerhouse of scientific production are built off the backs of Chinese postdocs who are providing much of the hidden research. In many ways, they are building the academic railroads that we so look back upon as being embarrassing. But they're the new railroad workers today, but yet mistakenly seen as threats, as foreigners, because they're different. And so I think we need to think about what are we committed to. advance in the groups of a minority group, and that may come at the expense of really promoting social justice more globally. And I think it's easy to confuse the two in othering people because there may be nationalism here, in addition to racism. So those are some things to keep that we should also be considering.
But one thing we need to do is better disaggregate domestic students from international students too, because I think that inflates the numbers, not just for Asians, but for other groups, like you said, Latinos and so forth. We need to do a better job, especially public institutions that have be held responsible for serving the citizens of that state. But yeah, this is a very, very interesting. Another part of the story, by the way, is harassment of international students. I mean, they're, like I said, they're very vulnerable, but you know, they are less likely to make charges or claims of discrimination and harassment. So yes, this is I like to see it as, you know, first of all, a story about exploitation of graduate students and exploiting the most vulnerable. You know, you lose your green card, right, because your faculty sponsor won't sign off next year. You wasted 2 years of your life, and your family's investment, life earnings, really, for many of these folks to send them for education. Another question, thank you. Another question. Yes.
So as you know, we do not have an Asian American Studies program here at UofA. So what can we as students do to start one?
What can you do to start? It seems like a question that we asked ourselves in the 60s. And well, you know, I don't know what you've done so far, so it's hard to give you a straight answer. I mean, an answer that would be helpful, but you know, just the numbers. I asked you when I was coming in, you know, what the proportion of Asian American students was at UofA, and you said somewhere around 10 to 12%. You've exceeded, no, somebody said no. What, does anyone here have a really good handle on this number? What's the number here, proportion? Anyone know for sure? See, that's one problem here.
It's closer to 4. It's closer to 4. It's about half of that 10 to 12.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. But still, I mean, it's reflective of the, it's close to the national average, which is, you know, about 7% now. But pointing, you know, first and foremost, always pointing to the critical mass, that there's a critical mass. But the other argument that's not made enough, because administration usually view this as a more of a political than an educational. It certainly is political. You know, almost everything education is, including admissions, by the way. It's a political process, just as much as a meritocratic one. But aside from that, you know, the political part gets things done, certainly. But emphasizing the educational is just as important, because you're looking at a field that has accumulated nearly 4 decades of knowledge that is critical to understanding U.S. society and in anticipating the future of our country. I mean, I could go on, and I mean, I put, you know, Frank Wu's book Yellow. I pointed to Dana Takagi's Retreat from Race. We could put Michael Omi's racial formation, which is, you know, one of the leading theories of race in the U.S. society. You know, on and on. This is so important, and I, you know, I think there's a case to be made about the intellectual failure of an institution when they leave this out of the curriculum for students. And I, would think educators, this would have traction, this kind of argument would have traction, because the old school, right, of getting Asian American studies at an institution is to have your sit-ins and stuff. I mean, that as we know, Missouri still works. and but good. But now you have a lot more ammunition, so to speak. I'm sorry to use that language, but you have a much stronger case to make, intellectually, certainly. And demographic, politically, there's so many ways of making this case. I think and plus there's social media. There's social media, and I mean, look what happened to Alexandra Wallace. You look up Asians in the library and on Google and see what comes up. It's fascinating. There's social media you can use behind you to create momentum, and so I say think outside the box. Use all the things available to you today that generations before you did not have to make the case, and they were still able to make the case. Yes. By the way, a footnote to that, I know it's harder in Arizona than other places. I follow the politics here, so I know I don't mean to minimize what's ahead of you, but it's I'm sure you got a fight on your hands.
You shared a quote about Asians being bystanders and they're seen as either American or minorities, and I was wondering if you could speak to this is generalization, but wanting to be under the radar and wanting to focus on colorblindness. And so we probably don't want to, I hate to use the phrase rock the boat, but we're seen as invisible. I don't know if you saw the Asian American reporter photographer that was told media out for the Missouri protest. And I think people didn't know what to do with him because he was Asian. And the protest was against white media. And here was this Asian American photographer who spoke, I have every right to be here. I'm for civil rights. I am for right to protest. And the First Amendment right is for me to go to class and document what's happening. So can you speak to that?
Yeah. And first of all, I'll say this, that Asian Americans have become much more vocal and much more. I mean, take a look at some of these things that I put up here. Present a much stronger voice in articulating their positions, and so I think that is shifting. What we continue to contend with are the dominant racial narratives that are pretty much, as I discussed, is the lens for interpreting our presence and our activism. So this is the issue that I think we got to address more upfront, is that this kind of work that's being done is being interpreted in certain ways that were created through imagined stories, and as a result, these efforts don't get the mileage that they should. So the person speaking out isn't going to be viewed as the leader of the movement, even though this person of Asian American descent, and if that a woman, has been the strongest and most active voice because of these stereotypes that are going on. So I do think that there are very strong voices out there, and this is happening. That is, there is no culture submissiveness that's holding us back, you know. And I know you're not saying that, but the idea that that Asian Americans don't want to rock the boat, that's just bullshit in my opinion. You know, I've been rocking the boat for a long time, and everyone thinks I'm not rocking the boat, which is funny. But hey, look, I may be rocking it a different way, but I'm rocking it. And so the thinking is, you know, and we don't have to assimilate into a particular way of doing things. It's not, there's no one way of doing things. And that's what I think is you know, the benefit of being at a classroom. You get to invest where you want to head. But you have to be very intentional about it. And you have to understand what those obstacles are. And I pointed to one set of them, racial narratives. But it's very wide open. I look at some areas, for example, like fashion. You think I'm interested in fashion. but you know, look at all these Asian designers. I mean, they're just breaking the trend. Look at, you know, we have athletes too. They're just breaking the trend. Now, are they being noticed? I'm not. You know, that's the other thing. So let's prop up those folks. Maybe that's one way of doing it. Let's prop them up. Let's make sure that they get the recognition too that they deserve. But I'm not so sure I agree that there's no law to the book. There is. It's done in a different way, and it may not be recognized because we are still stuck in thinking about Asian Americans and certain things. Yes.
Question for you. So after the California voters banned the use of race-conscious admissions, can you tell us a little bit about what alternatives were tried in the state to and how effective they were in creating a diverse student body?
Yeah, there have been many alternatives. One is the percent plan. So the UCs have gone into, you know, if you graduate, I think these days you're not 5%. Correct me if I'm wrong. They're initially a 5% fine. If you graduate from the top 5% of your high school, any high school, you are eligible to UC education. You will be admitted. Another thing, we've moved to holistic admissions. So considering, you know, more than just numbers, there's been, you know, a lot of finessing about essays when we talk about grit, emphasizing grit and finding ways to capture that in admissions, but paying more attention to the student's record beyond the numbers, because the numbers, you know, tend to be a sticky issue. What else has there been?
I think with some commercial relation agreements between the community colleges.
That's really.
And the UCs too, which is another important point of access for students.
Yeah.
UCs. They might not be able to start at the UC, but if they attend a community college and they meet the requirements of the UC, they're guaranteed admission to the UC campus.
So a number of different things have been used when the UCs stopped considering race. Community, you know, involvement was another one that ended up being weighted more heavily than it used to be before. A number of different ones. But the second part of the question is, you know, the effects. So there are a couple of unique things that happened. One was the economic downturn in California. And we're recovering much more now. Certain communities more so than others. But this hit us really hard in terms of funding for higher education. This has put greater pressure on us to become more self-sustained, support ourselves, because the state reduced their financial support to us. So we try to cover that revenue through admitting more out-of-state students, international students, and all that business. So there's this, your faculty do better job studying privatization than any in the country, so they can tell you about that. But there's that issue. There's also the issue that you have two flagships in California, UCLA and Berkeley, and these changes don't really impact those two institutions as much as we had hoped. So we are still struggling with getting adequate African American student enrollment. There was a video that undergraduate African American students at UCLA put on last year, and it was called Black Bruins. Take a look at that, and it shows really alarming statistics about enrollment of African American, especially men. And then the African American law students also put together. See, this is what I mean about, you got new ways of attracting the attention of administrators, YouTube and all that. And those two videos have a profound effect in how the university thought about admissions and put greater pressure on us to do more. But unfortunately, we're still recovering, I think. We should be, if it hadn't been for Proposition 209, I think we would be a lot significantly further ahead. And let's not forget, graduate school is still being hurt, especially in medicine. And that's a public health issue. That's a public health issue.
Yeah, great, really nice lecture, really enjoyed that. I want to ask what's your counter-narrative? These are the master narratives about Asian Americans. And one of the things I like about what you did was you situated that affirmative action is not just about education. And so, although there are these narratives like about model minority in education, there's also considerable evidence that success in education doesn't always translate into success in occupational attainment, Asian Americans. And I don't know if that figures into a counter-narrative that, well, yeah, we perform well in the university, but then when it comes to hiring us, we become the yellow peril. So, like, what is the counter-narrative? You started to talk about it to some extent. Like, we do rock the boat, maybe we rock it in different ways. But what counter-narrative do you offer, or have you seen these two dominant ones that you would like
This
to
is,
see?
I'm just the messenger here.
Go on a riff.
I'd probably be sitting in the room writing that book of the counter-narrative and standing up here. I think that's the trouble right now.
You're living the counter-narrative, don't
that would take a great deal of reflection to figure out, but I don't really have one. I mean, are there folks in this room have one that come to mind? I think that's the problem. I talk to my graduate students about this and worry about what racial politics would look like. I mean, with the interest of having a collective kind of collective movement or collective interest, at least one that you could call a collective interest, it seems to be more fragmented. It seems to go issue by issue. And you know that there is no counter-narrative working or operating here because we're taking it on issue by issue. And that's really, those partnerships are really fragile when you go issue by issue. And we saw that consistently with a number of political issues, including on immigration. And so, well, I'll tell you this. I don't think the counter-narrative, if we do develop one, is going to just characterize the it's going to be a much bigger one. Still, one that captures race. So race isn't going away. But this narrative, I think, is going to be a much, it's a different one. It's going to be less group specific around specific interests and specific issues, but a much larger one. And really, I point to historians. I look to historians for that narrative. But thanks for asking. I see my time is up.
Thank you, Professor Chang, for enlightening us about the complexities that we face when thinking about affirmative action. Please give Professor Chang another round of applause. Please don't forget to fill out the evaluation forms. If you don't have one, Jessica will give you one. Jessica, please raise your hand.
Yeah, they're gonna fire me.
He was great.
Professor Chang, on behalf of APASA and the College of Education, we thank you for your time. We appreciate the time you spent with us today to break down the concept of affirmative action and its impact on our communities, especially as AAPI students. We encourage you and everyone to stay and enjoy the food. Please take another moment to fill out the evaluation and leave it at the registration table when you leave. Thank you.